It is September 29th, 1982, a Wednesday. The air in Chicago is crisp, signaling the beginning of autumn. In the suburb of Elk Grove Village, a 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman wakes up feeling a little under the weather. It is nothing serious. A sore throat, a runny nose, the kind of mild cold that every 7th grader dreads because it means missing school or perhaps missing out on time with friends. It was the most mundane morning imaginable. That is what makes this story so terrifying. Mary tells her parents she isn't feeling well. Her parents, loving and attentive, do what any parent in America would have done at that time. They go to the medicine cabinet. There is no struggle with plastic wrap. There is no foil seal to peel back. There is no cotton ball to remove. They simply unscrew the cap of a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, shake out one red and white capsule, and give it to their daughter with a glass of water. Mary takes the pill. She goes into the bathroom. Minutes later, her father hears the sound of something falling. He calls out to her. No answer. He pushes the door open and finds his little girl collapsed on the floor. She is unconscious. Panic sets in immediately. Paramedics are called. They rush her to Alexian Brothers Medical Center, frantic to save her life. But nothing works. At 7 a.m., Mary Kellerman is pronounced dead. The doctors are baffled. They suspect a stroke, which is almost unheard of in a 12-year-old, or perhaps a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. They have no idea that Mary is just the first domino in a chain of horror that is about to grip the entire nation. And while the Kellerman family is being torn apart by grief in Elk Grove Village, just a few miles away in Arlington Heights, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus is stopping at a Jewel Osco store. He has a minor chest pain, just a nagging ache. He picks up a bottle of Tylenol, pays for it, and heads home. He walks into his house, takes a couple of capsules, and sighs. He thinks relief is on the way. Instead, minutes later, he is on the floor, gasping for air. His blood pressure crashes. His heart stops. This is where the story shifts from a medical mystery to a full-blown nightmare. Adam Janus is rushed to the hospital and dies. The doctors there are just as confused as the ones treating Mary Kellerman. They label it a massive heart attack. A tragedy, certainly, but natural causes. The family gathers at Adam's home to mourn. His brother Stanley and Stanley's wife Teresa rush over to comfort the family. The house is filled with weeping and shock. Stanley has a headache. Stress, grief, the crying, it all takes a toll. Teresa isn't feeling well either, so they do the most natural thing in the world. They go into the kitchen. They see the open bottle of Tylenol on the counter, the same bottle Adam used just hours before. It is chilling to think about that moment. Stanley and Teresa take capsules from that bottle. Within minutes, Stanley collapses. Teresa collapses. The other family members can't believe what they are seeing. They just watched Adam die, and now his brother and sister-in-law are seizing on the floor in front of them. The paramedics who arrive are the same ones who transported Adam earlier. They think they are walking into a house with a carbon monoxide leak or some environmental toxin. They have no idea that the weapon is sitting right there on the kitchen counter, looking completely innocent. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, we have to look at the landscape of 1982. This was a time before the hypervigilance we have today regarding product safety. Tylenol was not just a painkiller, it was the painkiller. Johnson & Johnson held 37% of the market. It was trusted implicitly. It was the alternative to aspirin, safe for stomachs, safe for children. The idea that someone would tamper with medicine was not on anyone's radar. It was a simpler time in terms of packaging, but that simplicity was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited.
Exactly. You could walk into a drugstore, open a box of toothpaste, check the smell, and put it back. You could unscrew a bottle of juice, take a sip, and put it back. Not that people did, but the barrier wasn't there. There were no induction seals, no shrink bands. The capsules themselves were 2-piece gelatin shells. You could pull them apart with your fingernails, empty the powder, put something else in, and slide them back together. It was effortless, and that is exactly what the killer did. The killer utilized potassium cyanide. For those who aren't familiar with chemistry, cyanide is a rapidly acting cellular asphyxiant. It effectively stops the cells in your body from using oxygen. You could have lungs full of air, but your cells are suffocating. It attacks the heart and the central nervous system almost instantly. The lethal dose is incredibly small. The killer filled these capsules with 65 milligrams or more of cyanide.
The lethal dose for a human is roughly half that. These weren't just poisoned, they were loaded with overkill. The victims didn't stand a chance. Back at the hospital in Arlington Heights, chaos is unfolding. Stanley Janis dies that same day. Teresa lasts a little longer, but she dies 2 days later. The medical staff is now looking at 3 deaths from the same family in the span of hours. That rules out a simple heart attack. A nurse named Helen Jensen was actually one of the first to suspect the Tylenol. She found the bottle in the Janis home and counted the pills. She noticed something odd about the smell. Cyanide is often said to smell like bitter almonds, though not everyone can smell it genetically, but she sensed something was wrong. Helen Jensen is an unsung hero here. She brought her suspicion to the investigators, but initially she was dismissed. A poisoned pill? It sounded like fiction. But the bodies kept piling up. Mary Reiner, 27, had just given birth to her 4th child. She took Tylenol for postpartum pain. She died. Paula Prince, a flight attendant, 35 years old. She was found dead in her apartment with an open bottle of Tylenol on her bathroom sink. Mary McFarland, 31. It was happening all over the Chicago suburbs. There was no geographic concentration small enough to pinpoint a single store, but it was all in Cook and DuPage counties. The turning point came when the connection was finally solidified by the fire department and the medical examiner. They retrieved the bottles from the victims' homes. They ran the tests. The results were terrifying. The capsules were teeming with cyanide. Once that news broke, the panic was unlike anything the country had seen since the assassination of JFK. This wasn't a political figure being targeted. It was everyday people doing an everyday thing. Suddenly, every medicine cabinet in America felt like a minefield. By Thursday, September 30th, the news was out. Do not take Tylenol. Police officers were actually driving down the streets of Chicago neighborhoods using bullhorns to warn people. Can you imagine that image? Cruisers rolling slowly through suburbia, announcing that the medicine in your home might kill you. It was apocalyptic. All 3 major television networks led with this story. It wasn't just a local crime anymore. It was a national emergency. And the investigation kicked into high gear immediately. A task force was formed involving the FBI, the Illinois State Police, and local departments. They had to figure out how the poison got there. Was it done at the factory? That was the first assumption. Johnson & Johnson halted production immediately. But they quickly realized the victims had purchased bottles from different stores, different lot numbers, and even different manufacturing plants. Mary Kellerman's bottle came from a Jewel store. The Janis bottle came from a Jewel Osco. Others came from Walgreens. The manufacturing dates were months apart. This led to the terrifying conclusion. The tampering did not happen at the factory. It happened on the shelves. This was retail terrorism. The killer had purchased, or perhaps shoplifted, bottles of extra-strength Tylenol, taken them to a secondary location, laced the capsules with cyanide, and then returned to the stores to place them back on the shelves, right at the front where the next customer would grab them. He or she used the store's own distribution system to deliver death.
The psychological profile of such a killer is baffling. There was no demand, no manifesto, just random cold-blooded murder. The victim could have been anyone. A grandmother, a child, a celebrity, a politician. It was completely indiscriminate. And while the police were hunting for a ghost, Johnson & Johnson had to make a decision that would become a case study in business schools for decades to come. Their CEO, James Burke, didn't try to spin it. He didn't try to hide. Burke's response was unprecedented. The FBI actually advised him not to recall the product nationwide, fearing it would encourage copycats. But Burke ignored them. He put public safety above profit. He recalled 31 million bottles of Tylenol. That was a retail value of over $100 million in 1982 money. He basically burned the inventory. They issued urgent warnings to hospitals and distributors. They offered to swap Tylenol capsules for solid tablets, which were harder to tamper with. It was a scorched earth strategy to save the brand by killing the product temporarily. And it worked, eventually. But in those first few weeks, the fear was palpable. Poison control centers were overwhelmed. People were showing up at ERs with panic attacks, convinced they had been poisoned because they had a headache, which was ironically why they took the Tylenol in the first place. Halloween was effectively canceled in many towns that year. Parents were terrified of candy being poisoned. The trust in society had been fractured. The hunt for the killer produced thousands of leads, but no smoking gun. One name that always comes up is James Lewis. He sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the killings. The FBI tracked him down.
He was a con man, a bright but disturbed individual who had been accused of murder before. They caught him in a library in New York City. But here's the catch. They couldn't place him in Chicago during the days the bottles were planted. He was likely just an opportunist trying to make money off the tragedy. He went to prison for extortion, but he was never charged with the murders. Another suspect was Roger Arnold, a dock worker who had a background in chemistry and possessed manuals on how to make poisons. He acted erratically and reportedly told people he had cyanide. The police held him, questioned him, but they never found enough physical evidence to link him to the specific bottles. The tragedy of Roger Arnold is that the media attention ruined his life, and he later had a mental breakdown that led to him killing a man he thought had snitched on him. It was a mess, a ripple effect of the Tylenol case destroying even more lives. The true legacy of these murders, however, isn't in the suspect list. It is in your pantry. Look at any bottle of medicine, any jar of peanut butter, any carton of milk you buy today. The foil seal, the plastic ring that breaks when you twist the cap, the warning that says do not use if seal is broken, that is the Tylenol bill. Congress passed legislation in 1983 making it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products. The FDA issued regulations requiring tamper-resistant packaging for all over-the-counter drugs. We traded convenience for safety, and we never looked back. It also changed the pharmaceutical industry's manufacturing processes. Capsules fell out of favor for a long time, replaced by caplets, solid tablets shaped like capsules that couldn't be pulled apart. It changed how we shop. We became suspicious consumers. Before 1982, the consumer relationship with the manufacturer was built on blind faith. After 1982, it was trust but verify. The innocence of the post-war consumer boom died in Chicago that week. 40 years later, the Tylenol murders remain unsolved. The DNA technology has improved, and authorities have periodically revisited the evidence, testing the few remaining capsules for touch DNA, but no match has ever been publicly confirmed. The killer walked away into the shadows, leaving 7 dead and a nation forever changed. Somewhere, someone might know the truth, or perhaps the killer took the secret to their grave. But every time you struggle to peel that foil seal off a bottle of aspirin, remember Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, and the victims of the Tylenol poisonings. That little piece of foil is their memorial.
The date was September 29th, 1982. It was a Wednesday, early in the morning, in Elk Grove Village, a quiet suburb of Chicago. The air was turning crisp, the kind of typical Midwestern autumn morning where families are rushing to get their kids to school and get themselves to work. In the Kellerman household, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up feeling sluggish. She had a sore throat and the sniffles. Nothing serious, just a run-of-the-mill cold. The kind of thing thousands of kids wake up with every day. You don't think twice about it. Exactly. Her parents, Dennis and Gina, did what any parent would do. They wanted to make her comfortable. So at roughly 6:30 in the morning, they gave Mary 1 extra-strength Tylenol capsule. It was the leading pain reliever in the country, a staple in millions of medicine cabinets. Mary took the pill, went into the bathroom, and collapsed on the floor. Her father heard the thud. When he rushed in, she was non-responsive. They called the paramedics immediately, desperate to save their little girl. But by 7 a.m., Mary Kellerman was pronounced dead at Alexian Brothers Medical Center. The doctors were baffled. It looked like a stroke, but 12-year-olds don't just drop dead of strokes. That has to be every parent's worst nightmare. 1 minute she has a cold, the next she's gone, and nobody can tell you why, and the nightmare was only beginning. While the Kellermans were paralyzed by this sudden, inexplicable grief, another tragedy was unfolding just a few miles away, in Arlington Heights. Adam Janus, a 27-year-old postal worker, woke up with a minor chest pain. He thought maybe he was coming down with something or had tweaked a muscle. He walked into a local store, purchased a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, drove home, and took a couple of capsules. Roughly an hour later, he suffered what looked like a massive heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital, and despite the frantic efforts of the emergency room staff, Adam Janus died shortly after arriving. 2 sudden deaths in the same morning. Both young people, both relatively healthy. But at this point, nobody is connecting the dots, right? They're in different towns, different hospitals. Right, at that specific moment, these were treated as isolated medical anomalies. But what happened next is what turned this from a series of tragedies into a horror movie. The Janus family gathered at Adam's home in Arlington Heights to mourn. You can imagine the atmosphere. Shock, tears, family members bringing food, trying to comfort Adam's distraught life. Adam's brother, Stanley Janus, who was 25, and Stanley's wife, Teresa, who was only 19, were there. The stress was overwhelming.
Stanley had a headache, understandably so. Teresa wasn't feeling well either. So they went into the kitchen and found the bottle of Tylenol that Adam had purchased just hours earlier. The bottle was sitting on the counter. Stanley took a capsule. Teresa took a capsule. Oh no, they took pills from the same bottle that killed Adam? They did. Within minutes, Stanley collapsed. Teresa collapsed shortly after. The family watched in absolute terror as 2 more loved ones fell to the floor in the exact same spot where Adam had been stricken earlier that day. The paramedics who arrived were the same ones who had tried to save Adam. They walked into a house they had just left, only to find 2 more family members dying. Stanley died that same day. Teresa fought for her life on life support for 2 days before she passed away. In the span of 24 hours, the Janus family lost 3 people. That is absolutely devastating. And at that point, the paramedics must have realized something environmental was happening. You don't have 3 people in one house drop dead from natural causes. Precisely. Initially, they suspected carbon monoxide poisoning. It's the silent killer. It fits the profile of a whole household getting sick. The fire department checked the air quality, but the results were negative. No gas leak, no carbon monoxide. This is where a sharp-eyed off-duty firefighter named Philip Capitelli comes in, along with a nurse named Helen Jensen. Jensen was at the hospital assisting with the Janus family. She heard that they had all taken Tylenol. She had a hunch, something about the way the pupils were dilated, the way the victims had convulsed. She told the medical examiner she thought it was the Tylenol.
Was she taken seriously? I feel like blaming a headache pill for a triple homicide sounds crazy in 1982. She was dismissed at first, but she insisted. She and the investigators went back to the Janus home and retrieved the bottle. They opened it up, and Helen Jensen smelled something faint but distinct, the smell of bitter almonds. Now, if you know anything about toxicology or have read enough Agatha Christie novels, you know what the smell of bitter almonds means. Cyanide. Potassium cyanide. Highly lethal. It interferes with the body's ability to use oxygen. Essentially, your cells suffocate even though your lungs are full of air. It's a terrifying, painful way to die. The lab ran the tests and the results were off the charts. The capsules in Adam Janus's bottle weren't just contaminated, they were packed with 65 milligrams of cyanide. That is more than 10,000 times the lethal dose. The killer hadn't just dipped them, they had emptied the acetaminophen powder and refilled the red half of the capsule with pure poison. So someone weaponized the medicine. They turned a cure into a kill switch. Once they confirmed it was the Tylenol, did they link it to Mary Kellerman? Yes. Firefighter Capitelli was speaking with a colleague in Elk Grove Village, trying to make sense of the Janus deaths, and the colleague mentioned the 12-year-old girl, Mary Kellerman, who had died that morning. They compared notes. Both had taken Tylenol. They retrieved Mary's bottle. It tested positive for cyanide. The link was confirmed. But the bodies kept dropping. Mary McFarland, 31, died in Elmhurst. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, was found dead in her Chicago apartment with an open bottle of Tylenol in her bathroom sink. Mary Reiner, 27, who had just given birth to her 4th child a week earlier, took a pill and died. 7 victims in total, all random, all connected by one red and white capsule. The randomness is what created the panic, isn't it? If it was just one family, you could suspect a personal vendetta. But these people didn't know each other. They bought the pills at different stores. And that was the terrifying realization for the Chicago police and the FBI. The victims purchased their Tylenol at Jewel Foods, Osco Drug, Walgreens, completely different chains in different suburbs. This meant the tampering hadn't happened at a single store. It also likely didn't happen at the factory, because the pills came from 2 different production plants, one in Pennsylvania and one in Texas. The only logical explanation was that someone, a madman, had gone into these various stores, bought the bottles, taken them home, laced the capsules with cyanide, and then, chillingly, put the bottles back on the store shelves. He put them back. He hunted strangers by waiting for them to buy relief for a headache. The psychological impact of that is massive. How did the city react? Chicago went into a state of siege. You have to remember, this was 1982. There was no social media, no instant push notifications. Police cars drove through the streets using their loudspeakers to warn people, do not take Tylenol, dispose of your Tylenol. It was like wartime. News anchors were breaking into programming every hour. People were rushing to emergency rooms if they even coughed, thinking they were poisoned. The Poison Control Center in Chicago was inundated with thousands of calls a day.
But the most unprecedented reaction came from the manufacturer itself, Johnson & Johnson. This is often taught in business schools as the gold standard of crisis management, isn't it? It is, and for good reason. At the time, Tylenol controlled 37% of the painkiller market. It was their crown jewel. When the news broke, company executives were advised by some lawyers to deny liability, to try and write it out. But the CEO, James Burke, did the opposite. He put public safety above profit immediately. He halted all advertising. He sent out 450,000 telex messages to hospitals and doctors' offices. And then he did the unthinkable. He issued a nationwide recall of every single bottle of Tylenol on the market. That was 31 million bottles. The retail value was over $100 million. They took it all back and destroyed it. That's a staggering amount of money to lose voluntarily, but it probably saved the brand in the long run.
It saved the brand, and it likely saved lives. J&J offered a reward of $100,000 for information leading to the killer. They opened their plants to the media to show that the tampering couldn't have happened during manufacturing. They were transparent. But while the corporation was handling the PR, the police were hunting a ghost. They had no witnesses, no surveillance cameras in the aisles back then, no DNA technology to swipe the bottles for skin cells. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, and the haystack was the entire Chicago metropolitan area. So who were the suspects? You have a crime that requires a specific set of skills, knowledge of chemicals, access to cyanide, and the patience to disassemble and reassemble capsules. The investigation generated thousands of leads, but a few names rose to the top. The most prominent one was James Lewis. A few days after the murders, Johnson & Johnson received a handwritten letter. It was an extortion note. The writer demanded $1 million to stop the killing. The police traced the letter to New York City and eventually to James Lewis. Lewis was a con man with a dark past. He had been accused of murdering an elderly Kansas City man years prior, though the charges were dropped due to a technicality regarding the search warrant. He was intelligent, manipulative, and clearly opportunistic. So he claimed to be the Tylenol killer? He implied it heavily to get the money. The FBI launched a massive manhunt. They found him in a New York library, researching how to transfer funds anonymously. He was arrested, and the nation breathed a sigh of relief, thinking they had their man. But there was a problem. Investigators couldn't place Lewis in Chicago during the critical window when the bottles were spiked. He had been in New York. It turned out Lewis was just trying to profit off the tragedy. He was convicted of extortion and sent to prison for over a decade, but he likely wasn't the one who put the cyanide in the pills. That is almost more disturbing, that someone would see children dying and think, how can I make a quick buck off this? It speaks to a specific kind of pathology. Lewis continued to taunt investigators for years, even offering to help solve the case, providing drawings and theories that were disturbingly detailed. Some investigators still believe he might have traveled to Chicago or had an accomplice, but no hard evidence ever linked him to the physical bottles. Then there was Roger Arnold. He was a dock worker at a warehouse that supplied some stores, but more importantly, he was a known amateur chemist. He worked with hazardous chemicals for hobbies. He had been seen in a bar talking about how easy it would be to kill people with white powder. Police brought him in. They found a veritable chemistry lab in his home, including manuals on poisons. That sounds promising for the investigation. It did, but again, the evidence was circumstantial. He possessed the knowledge, but they couldn't prove he bought the cyanide or placed the bottles. The tragedy of Roger Arnold is that the media attention ruined his life. He had a nervous breakdown. A year later, feeling persecuted, he ended up shooting a man in a bar whom he mistakenly thought had reported him to the police. Arnold went to prison for that shooting, but he was never charged with the Tylenol murders. The pressure of being a suspect broke him, yet he likely wasn't the killer either. So we have a con man in New York and a chemist in Chicago, neither of whom stuck. Were there other theories? Maybe a disgruntled employee? That was a strong theory. The idea that someone angry at Johnson & Johnson, or perhaps a rival company, wanted to sabotage the brand. But the randomness of the store locations didn't fit a targeted corporate sabotage well. Usually that would be done at the distribution level, not retail. The retail placement suggested a desire to terrorize the public, not just hurt the company. The profile was of an anger retaliatory killer, someone lashing out at society. And sadly, this event inspired others. This is the copycat effect. In the months following the Chicago deaths, there were hundreds of tampering incidents reported across the U.S.
people putting pins in candy bars, adding bleach to soda bottles. It changed the psychology of the American consumer forever.
We talked about the legacy in the intro. Before this, you could just unscrew a cap and take a pill. There was no foil, no plastic wrap. It's hard for younger generations to imagine, but yes, you could walk into a store, open a jar of peanuts, eat one, and put it back. You could open a bottle of aspirin to check if the pills were crocked. It was an era of implicit trust. The Tylenol murders destroyed that trust overnight. Johnson & Johnson, led by James Burke, didn't just bring Tylenol back, they reinvented packaging. They introduced the triple-seal tamper-resistant packaging. First, the glued flops on the box. Second, the plastic shrink band around the neck of the bottle. And third, the foil seal over the mouth of the bottle that you have to puncture. The "do not use if seal is broken" warning we see on literally everything now. Exactly. In 1983, the U.S. Congress passed the Tylenol bill, making it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products. Before this, product tampering was a hodgepodge of state laws. Now it was a felony punishable by life in prison. This case effectively birthed the modern packaging industry. It's the reason it takes you 5 minutes to open a bottle of ibuprofen or a jar of salsa today. But despite the packaging changes in the laws, the 7 victims, Mary, Adam, Stanley, Teresa, Mary, Paula, and Mary, never got justice. The case is still open? Technically, yes. It remains an active investigation by the FBI and local police. In 2009, the FBI reopened the case to use modern forensic technology. They hoped to find touch DNA on the original bottles, which had been preserved in evidence. They raided James Lewis's home again in Massachusetts, seizing computers and documents. They looked at other old suspects. But so far, no smoking gun has emerged. The DNA samples were too degraded or too contaminated from decades of handling before protocol changes. The Tylenol murders remain the perfect crime in the worst possible way. The killer struck, vanished, and changed the world, leaving 7 families broken and a mystery that has haunted Chicago for over 40 years. It's terrifying to think that the person who did this might still be alive, just watching the world adopt to what they did, just walking around knowing they got away with it. It is a chilling thought. And while the safety seals give us a sense of security, the Tylenol murders taught us a hard lesson, that we are vulnerable in the most mundane moments of our lives. When we are sick, when we are reaching for help, we are trusting a chain of strangers. The killer exploited that trust. We moved from an era of innocence to an era of suspicion. And every time you struggle to peel that foil off a bottle of medicine, you are participating in a ritual of remembrance for those 7 people who died in the autumn of 1982. Let's go back for a second to the immediate aftermath for the families. You mentioned the Janus family lost 3 people. What happened to the survivors? How do you even recover from that? Recovery is a strong word. I don't think you ever truly recover. For the Janus family, the trauma was absolute. They had to plan 3 funerals in a single week. The patriarch of the family, Autumn and Stanley's father, was reportedly so grief-stricken he could barely function. There was also a massive amount of fear. Remember, they didn't know initially if it was genetic or something in the house's water. For a brief window, they were pariahs because people were afraid to go near the house. Once the Tylenol link was proven, the isolation turned to pity. But the damage was done. And for the Kellerman family, Dennis and Gina, they became the face of the tragedy because Mary was the youngest. They spent years advocating for safer packaging, trying to give Mary's death some meaning. But interviews with them over the years show parents who simply never stopped missing their daughter. They kept her room exactly as it was for a long time. And the financial settlements? Did Johnson & Johnson pay the families? They did. Although J&J was not found liable in court because the tampering happened after the product left their control, they eventually reached undisclosed settlements with the families of the victims. It was part of their strategy to be compassionate rather than defensive. But no check replaces a child or a spouse. The psychological scars for the entire Chicago region ran deep. For years, people checked their Halloween candy with extreme paranoia. The Tylenol scare became a cultural touchstone. It's why, even today, if there is a slight manufacturing error in food or drug production, the recall is immediate and total. No company wants to be the next Tylenol, even though Tylenol itself survived. It's interesting you mention Halloween. This happened in late September and October. It must have ruined Halloween that year. It effectively canceled it. In 1982, many towns in the Chicago area banned trick-or-treating outright. They were terrified that the madman would switch from pills to candy corn. Parents threw parties at schools or community centers instead of letting kids go door to door.
It was the first time that the communal trust of the neighborhood really fractured on a massive scale. Before 1982, the idea of a neighbor poisoning a kid was an urban legend. After Tylenol, it felt like a plausible threat. Let's dig a little deeper into the specific pills. You said they were capsules. This is why we mostly see caplets or tablets now, right? Correct. The capsules in 1982 were two-piece gelatin shells. You could pull the red half apart from the white half with your fingernails, dump the powder, and slide them back together. There was no glue sealing the two halves. After the murders, J&J eventually moved away from capsules entirely for over-the-counter sales, developing the gel cap, which is a solid tablet coated in gelatin to make it easy to swallow, but it can't be pulled apart. If you try to tamper with a modern coplet, it breaks or looks obviously damaged. The physical design of the medicine itself had to change to prevent the mechanical ability to hide poison. It really was a perfect storm of vulnerability. A popular product, an easy-to-open container, and an easy-to-modify pill. And a highly lethal poison that was relatively easy to acquire if you worked in certain industries. Cyanide is used in electroplating, jewelry making, and photography. It wasn't something you could buy at the grocery store, but it wasn't impossible to get. This brings us back to the psychological profile of the killer. The FBI profilers believed the perpetrator was likely a loner, intelligent, unpresuming, someone who held a grudge against society, but not necessarily the victim specifically. They called it displacement. The killer is angry at X, so they take it out on Y. The randomness was the point. They wanted to exert power over a city that ignored them. By making everyone afraid, they became the most powerful person in Chicago. Did they ever look at the distribution drivers, the people driving the trucks from the warehouse to the stores? They did. They interviewed hundreds of delivery drivers. The logistics were analyzed to death. But the timeline didn't work for a driver. A driver drops off boxes in the back. They don't stock the shelves personally in most cases. And remember, the bottles were found at the front of the shelves, pushed to the front to be the next one picked. This implies the killer walked the aisles, waited for a moment when no one was looking, and slid the poisoned bottle into the front position. It's a chillingly intimate act, standing in the aisle of a grocery store, holding death in your hand, and waiting for a mother or a father to come by. That image is haunting. You mentioned earlier that the case was reopened in 2009. Have there been any updates since then? Any deathbed confessions?
There was a flurry of interest again around the 40th anniversary in 2022. Investigators were looking at the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, as a potential suspect at one point because he was from the Chicago area and his parents lived there, and the timing of his visits sometimes aligned. He also fit the anti-corporate intelligent loner profile. However, Kaczynski denied it, and the FBI never found a solid link. He preferred bombs, not poison. So no deathbed confessions. James Lewis passed away in 2023, taking whatever he knew or didn't know to the grave. With every passing year, the likelihood of a solved case diminishes. The physical evidence degrades, witnesses die, and memories fade. But for the law enforcement community in Chicago, it's the one that got away. It hangs over the department. It's the Jack the Ripper of the 20th century in a way. A specific window of terror, a specific method, and then silence. That's an apt comparison. The killer stopped. Why? Did they die? Did they move? Or did the fear they caused satisfy them? We will likely never know, but we live in the world they created. Every time you buy a bottle of water and hear that plastic crack of the safety ring, you are hearing an echo of 1982. The Tylenol murders didn't just kill 7 people. They killed a version of America that was open and trusting. We gained safety, yes, but we lost that innocence, and that is the lasting tragedy of the case. Well, on that somber but important note, we have to wrap up. It's a heavy story, but one that explains so much about our daily lives. It does. It's a reminder of how fragile our systems are, and how one person's malice can force a global change. Thank you for listening to this examination of the Tylenol murders. It's a case that remains unsolved, but its impact is solved every day in every pharmacy aisle in the world.